Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Spirit, self-alienated spirit, culture. The ethical substance kept the antithesis confined within its simply unitary consciousness, and preserved this consciousness in an immediate unity with its essence. Essence has therefore the simple determinateness of mere being for consciousness, which is directed immediately upon it and is the essence in the form of custom. Consciousness neither thinks of itself as this particular exclusive self, nor has substance the significance of an existence excluded from it, with which it would have to become united only by alienating itself from itself and at the same time producing the substance itself. But the spirit whose self is an absolutely discrete unit has its content confronting it as an equally hard, unyielding reality, and here the world has the character of being something external, the negative of self-consciousness. This world is, however, a spiritual entity. It is in itself the interfusion of being and individuality. This is its existence. Its existence, is the work of self-consciousness, but it is also an alien reality already present and given, a reality which has a being of its own and in which it does not recognize itself. This real world is the external essence and the free content of legal right. But this external world, which the Lord of the world of legal right takes to himself, is not merely the elemental being confronting the self as something contingently given. On the contrary, it is his work, but not in a positive, rather in a negative sense. It obtains its existence through self-consciousness's own externalization and separation of itself from its essence, which, in the ruin and devastation which prevail in the world of legal right, seems to inflict on self-consciousness from without the violence of the liberated elements. These by themselves are sheer ruin and devastation, and the dissolution of themselves. This dissolution, however, this negative nature of theirs, is just the self. It is their subject, their activity and their process. But this activity and process whereby the substance becomes actual is the alienation of the personality for the self that has an absolute significance in its immediate existence. That is, without having alienated itself from itself, is without substance, and is the plaything of those raging elements. Its substance, therefore, is an externalization, and the externalization is the substance. That is, the spiritual powers ordering themselves into a world and thereby preserving themselves. Substance is in this way spirit, the self-conscious unity of the self and essence. Each has for the other the significance of alienation. Spirit is the consciousness of an objective real world, freely existing on its own account, but this consciousness is confronted by the unity of the self and essence, actual consciousness by pure consciousness. On the one side, actual self-consciousness, through its externalization, passes over into the actual world, and the latter back into actual self-consciousness. On the other side, the same actuality, both person and objectivity, is superseded. They are purely universal. This their alienation is pure consciousness, or essence. The present actual world has its antithesis directly in the beyond, which is both the thinking of it and its thought form. Just as the beyond has in the present world its actuality, but an actuality alienated from it. Consequently, this spirit constructs for itself not merely a world, but a world that is double, divided and self-opposed. The world of the ethical spirit is its own present world, and therefore each of its powers exist in this unity, and insofar as they are distinct from one another, they are in equilibrium with the whole. Nothing has the significance of being the negative of self-consciousness. Even the departed spirit is present in his blood relationship, in the self of the family, and the universal power of the government is the will, the self of the nation. Here, however, what is present has the significance only of an objective reality, the consciousness of which exists in a beyond. Each single moment qua essence receives this, and with it actuality from another. And so far as it is actual, its essence is something other than its own actuality. Nothing has a spirit that is grounded within itself and indwells it. But each has its being in something outside of and alien to it. The equilibrium of the whole is not the unity which remains with itself, nor the contentment that comes from having returned into itself, but rests on the alienation of opposites. The whole, therefore, like each single moment, is a self-alienated actuality. It falls apart into a realm in which a self-consciousness, as well as its object, is actual, and into another, the realm of pure consciousness, which, lying beyond the first, is not a present actuality, but exists only for faith. Now, just as the ethical world, which is separated into divine and human law in their various forms, and its consciousness, which is separated into knowing and not knowing, returns from that dividedness into its destiny, into the self as the negative power of the antithesis, so these two realms of the self-alienated spirit will also return into the self. But if the former was the first merely immediately valid self, the single person, this second realm, which returns out of its externalization into itself, will be the universal self, the consciousness which has grasped its notion. And these spiritual worlds, all of whose moments insist on a fixed actuality and non-spiritual existence of their own, will dissolve in pure intellectual insight. This insight as the self that apprehends itself completes the stage of culture. It apprehends nothing but self and everything as self, i.e. it comprehends everything, wipes out the objectivity of things, and converts all intrinsic being into a being for itself. In its hostility to faith, as the alien realm of essence lying in the beyond, it is enlightenment. This enlightenment completes the alienation of spirit in this realm too, in which that spirit takes refuge, and where it is conscious of an unruffled peace. It upsets the housekeeping of spirit in the household of faith by bringing into that household the tools and utensils of this world, a world which that spirit cannot deny is its own, because its consciousness likewise belongs to it. In this negative activity, pure insight at the same time realizes itself and produces its own object, the unknowable absolute being and the principle of a utility. Since in this way actuality has lost all substantiality and nothing in it has intrinsic being, not only the realm of faith but also the realm of the actual world is overthrown. This revolution gives birth to absolute freedom, and with this freedom the previously alienated spirit has completely returned into itself, has abandoned the region of culture and passes on to another region, the region of the moral consciousness. Golden rain. Anyway, where was I? The world of self-alienated spirit. The world of this spirit breaks up into two. The first is the world of reality, or of its self-alienation, but the other is that which spirit, rising above the first, constructs for itself in the ether of pure consciousness. This second world, standing in antithesis to that alienation, is for that very reason not free from it. On the contrary, it is really only the other form of that alienation, which consists precisely in being conscious of two different worlds, and which embraces both. Therefore, it is not the self-consciousness of absolute being as it is in and for itself, not religion that is here dealt with, but faith. So far as this is a flight from the real world, and thus is not in and for itself, this flight from the realm of the present is therefore in its own self dual-natured. Pure consciousness is the element into which a spirit raises itself, but it is not only the element of faith, but equally of the notion. Consequently, both together make their appearance at the same time, and the former comes into consideration only in its antithesis to the latter. Culture and its realm of actuality. We are going into the Enlightenment here, hence Enlightenment paintings. The spirit of this world is a spiritual essence that is permeated by a self-consciousness which knows itself and knows the essence as an actuality confronting it. But the existence of this world, as also the actuality of self-consciousness, rests on the process in which the latter divests itself of its personality, thereby creating its world. This world it looks on as something alien, a world therefore of which it must now take possession. But the renunciation of its being for self is itself the product of the actual world, and by this renunciation, therefore, self-consciousness directly takes possession of this world. Or we may say that self-consciousness is merely a something. It has actuality only insofar as it alienates itself from itself. By so doing, it gives itself the character of a universal, and its universality is its authentication and actuality. This equality with everyone is therefore not the equality of the sphere of legal right, not that immediate recognition and validity of self-consciousness simply because it is. On the contrary, to be valid, it must have conformed itself to the universal by the mediating process of alienation. The non-spiritual universality of the sphere of legal right accepts every natural form of character, as well of existence, and justifies them. The universality which counts here, however, is one that has made itself what it is, and for that reason is actual. It is therefore through culture that the individual acquires standing and actuality. His true original nature and substance is the alienation of himself as spirit from his natural being. This externalization is therefore both the purpose and the existence of the individual. Is it at once the means or the transition both of the mere thought, form, or substance into actuality, and conversely, of the specific individuality into essentiality. This individuality molds itself by culture into what it intrinsically is, and only by so doing is it an intrinsic being that has an actual existence. The measure of its culture is the measure of its actuality and power. Although here the self knows itself as this self, yet its actuality consists solely in the setting aside of its natural self. Consequently, the originally specific nature is reduced to the unessential difference of quantity, to a greater or lesser energy of will. But the purpose and content of the will belongs solely to the universal substance itself, and can only be a universal. The particularity of a nature which becomes purpose and content is something powerless and unreal. It is a kind of being which vainly and ridiculously strains every nerve to get going. It is the contradiction of giving to what is particular an actuality which is immediately a universal. If, therefore, individuality is erroneously supposed to be rooted in the particularity of nature and character, then in the actual world there are no individualities and no characters, but everyone is like everyone else. But this presumed individuality really only exists in someone's mind, an imaginary existence which has no abiding place in the world, where only that which externalizes itself, and therefore only the universal, obtains an actual existence. That is why such an imagined existence is esteemed for what it is, for a kind of being. Kind is not quite the same as espèce, the most horrid of all nicknames, for it denotes mediocrity and expresses the highest degree of contempt. Kind and good of its kind are, however, German expressions which add an air of honesty to this meaning, as if it were not really meant so badly. Or again, consciousness is, in fact, not yet aware what kind and what culture and reality are. What, in relation to the single individual, appears as his culture is the essential moment of the substance itself, namely, the immediate passage of the mere thought form of its universality into actuality, or culture is the simple soul of the substance by means of which what is implicit in the substance acquires an acknowledged real existence. The process in which the individuality molds itself by culture is therefore at the same time the development of it as the universal, objective essence, that is, the development of the actual world. Although this world has come into being through individuality, it is for self-consciousness immediately an alienated world which has the form of a fixed and solid reality over against it. But at the same time, certain that this world is its substance, it sets about making it its own. It gains this power over it through culture, which, looked at from this aspect, has the appearance of a self-consciousness, making itself conform to reality, and doing so to the extent that the energy of its original character and talent permit. What appears here as the power and authority of the individual, exercised over the substance, which is thereby superseded, is the same thing as the actualization of the substance, for the power of the individual consists in conforming itself to that substance. That is, in externalizing its own self and thus establishing itself as substance that has an objective existence. Its culture and its own actuality are therefore the actualization of the substance itself. The self knows itself as actual only as a transcendent self. Therefore, it is not constituted by the unity of consciousness of itself and the object. On the contrary, the object is, for the self, its negative. Thus, by means of the self as soul of the process, substance is so moulded and developed in its moments, that one opposite stirs the other into life. Each, by its alienation from the other, gives it an existence and equally receives from it an existence of its own. At the same time, each moment possesses its own specific nature as something unchallengeably valid and as a firm reality vis-a-vis the other. Thinking fixes this difference in the most general way by the absolute antithesis of good and bad, which, shunning each other, cannot in any way become one and the same. The soul of this fixed being, however, is the immediate transition into its opposite. Existence is really the perversion of every determinateness into its opposite, and it is only this alienation that is the essential nature and support of the whole. We have now to consider the process in which the moments are stirred into life and given an existence of their own. The alienation will alienate itself, and the whole will, through this alienation, return into its notion. We have first to consider the simple unitary substance itself in the immediate organization of its moments, which are present in this substance, but as yet have not been stirred into life. In the same way, the nature displays itself in the universal elements of air, water, fire, and earth. Air is the enduring, purely universal and transparent element, water the element that is perpetually sacrificed, fire the unity which energizes them into opposition, while at the same time it perpetually resolves the opposition. Lastly, earth, which is the firm and solid knot of this articulated whole, the subject of these elements and of their process, that from which they start and to which they return. So in the same way, the inner essence or simple spirit of self-conscious actuality displays itself in such universal, but sheer spiritual masses or spheres, displays itself as a world. In the first sphere, it is an implicitly universal, self-identical spiritual being. In the second, it is explicitly for itself and has become inwardly divided against itself, sacrificing and abandoning itself. In the third, which as self-consciousness is subject, it possesses directly, in its own self, the force of fire. In the first, it is conscious of itself as an intrinsic being, but in the second, it develops an explicit being of its own by sacrificing the universal spirit. Spirit, however, is itself at once the essence and the actuality of the whole, which sunders itself into a substance which endures, and a substance which sacrifices itself, and which at the same time also takes them back into its unity. It is both the outburst of flaming fire, which consumes the substance, and also the abiding form of that substance. We see that these spheres correspond to the community and the family in the ethical world, without, however, possessing the native spirit peculiar to the latter. On the other hand, while destiny is alien to the spirit, here self-consciousness is and knows itself to be the real power of these spheres. We have to consider, however, how, in the first instance, these two members are represented within pure consciousness as thoughts, or as having only an implicit being, and also how they are represented in actual consciousness as having an objective existence. In the simple form of thoughts, the first is the good, the self-accordant, immediate and unchangeable essence of every consciousness, the independent spiritual power of the in itself, alongside which the activity of actual consciousness is something merely incidental. Its other, on the contrary, is the passive spiritual essence, or the universal insofar as it surrenders itself and allows individuals to get in it the consciousness of their separate existence. It is the essence that is null and invalid, the bad. This absolute breakup of the essence is itself permanent, while the first essence is the foundation, starting point, and result of individuals who in it are purely universal. The second, on the other hand, is partly their self-sacrificing being for another, and partly for that very reason their perpetual return to self as separate individuals and the perpetual process in which they develop a being of their own. We have to consider how, in the first instance, these two members are represented within pure consciousness as thoughts, or as having only an implicit being, and also how they are represented in actual consciousness as having an objective existence. In the simple form of thought, the first is the good, the self-accordant, immediate and unchangeable essence of every consciousness, the independent spiritual power of the in itself, alongside which the activity of actual consciousness is something merely incidental. Its other, on the contrary, is the passive spiritual essence, or the universal, insofar as it surrenders itself and allows individuals to get in it the consciousness of their separate existence. It is the essence that is null and invalid, the bad. The absolute breakup of the essence is itself permanent, while the first essence is the foundation, starting point, and result of individuals who in it are purely universal. The second, on the other hand, is partly their self-sacrificing being for another, and partly for that very reason their perpetual return to itself as a separate individuals and the perpetual process in which they develop a being of their own. But secondly, these simple thoughts of good and bad are likewise immediately self-alienated. They are actual and are present in actual consciousness as objective moments. Thus the first essence is state power, the other is wealth. As state power is the simple substance, so too is the universal work, the absolute heart of the matter itself, in which individuals find their essential nature expressed, and where their separate individuality is merely a consciousness of their universality. It is also the work and the simple result from which the sense that it results from their doing has vanished. It remains the absolute foundation and subsistence of all they do, of all that they do. This simple ethereal substance of their life is in virtue of this determination of the unchangeable self-identity, mere being, and in addition merely a being for another. It is thus directly the opposite of itself, wealth. Although this is indeed something passive, something devoid of inner worth, it is equally the perpetually produced result of the labour and activity of all, just as it is dissipated again in the enjoyment of all. It is true that in the enjoyment, the individuality develops an awareness of himself as a particular individual, but this enjoyment itself is the result of the general activity, just as reciprocally wealth produces universal labour and enjoyment for all. In the actual, as simply the spiritual significance of being immediately universal. Each individual is quite sure that he is acting in his own interest when seeking this enjoyment, for it is in this that he becomes conscious of his own independent existence, and for that reason does not take it to be something spiritual. Yet even when looked at from an external point of view, it is evident that each in his own enjoyment provides enjoyment for all, just as in working for himself he is at the same time working for all, and all are working for him. His being for himself is therefore in itself universal, and his self-interest is something merely in his mind, something that cannot get as far as making a reality of what it means to do, namely, to do something that would not benefit all.